Hello and welcome. This is View from the Top. I am Modele Sarafa Yusuf. Thank you for joining us on this wet day in Lagos from where we're reaching you. Infrastructure such as railway, roads, dams, pipelines are a central building block of successful industrialization episodes from the 18th century Great Britain to 21st century China. Infrastructure affects economic development in very certain ways, from location of industries, property valuation, and cost of doing business, security concerns, and the general improvement in Human Development Index. Yet, infrastructural inadequacy remains one of the critical failure points in most parts of Africa. According to a 2018 United Nations report, infrastructure plans in developing countries often fail to link to integrated economic reforms and prosperity. In other words, infrastructure investment is not necessarily helping developing countries transform their economies and achieve sustainable prosperity. The infrastructure sector sits at a collision point of global disruptions, including shifts in capital availability, evolving social and environmental priorities, and rapid urbanization. The emergence of COVID-19 introduces an altogether new set of challenges. The forced cessation of travel, disruptions to supply chains, and changes in consumer behavior are among the COVID-19 impacts that are affecting every sector of infrastructure. Lockdown measures resulted in a sudden decline in public transport and road infrastructure usage, causing formerly stable demand and revenues to diminish overnight. Against this background, transport asset owners are wondering whether the sudden move to remote working will lead to a permanent shift in working patterns with consequent impacts on other industries such as real estate. The shutdown, in some estimation, could also lead to a shift from mass transit to micro-mobility options, which would affect future infrastructure planning. Questions are also being raised about the air travel and freight industries. If usage of air transport declines significantly, will the aviation sector need to consider fundamental changes in how airports are designed and built? And what would a switch to more localized supply chains do to volumes and demand for port owners and operators? The power sector is not immune either. Demand for electricity declined due to the lockdown. As a recent PwC study highlighted, the coincidence of COVID-19 with an oil price crash in March 2020 is likely to affect the transition to renewable energy in the short term, with cheap oil lessening the attractiveness in investment in renewables because oil-run generators will be more cost-effective. The interconnectedness, complexity, and global nature of the construction industry's supply chains and workforce affect the cost and schedule of infrastructure projects. Any slowdown across infrastructure investments due to, for example, uncertainty of demand or access to financing could also have an impact on project start dates or stall construction progress with potential longer-term economic repercussions for host countries. Truth is, ladies and gentlemen, the full impact of the pandemic will take years to play out. Yet, in the near term, experts believe it will reshape the industry in four ways: intensifying its focus on operational resilience, the affordability of infrastructure, the deployment of new technologies, and the need for sustainability. These and more are the issues I will be discussing with Dr. Tunde Sodade, who has managed, consulted, and taught about capital projects planning, development, and management through the major life cycle stages in leading institutions, municipal and state governments in North America and Nigeria. Dr. Sodade is currently the Managing Director of Lekki Worldwide Investments Limited, the special purpose vehicle through which the Lagos State government promotes, develops, and manages the development of the Lekki Free Trade Zone. Tunde Sodade, welcome to View from the Top.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me here.
Here's a quick biography of my guest. Yes, today, infrastructure is not just bricks and mortar, but a bridge to the future. That's the definition given by the Secretary General of the UN Conference on Trade and Development. How well do you agree with this statement?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. Infrastructure is not just bricks and mortar. Infrastructure encompasses, yes, physical assets, but then also human assets as well, human capital. Even some less tangible assets such as morality, right, can be encompassed under what infrastructure is. Because if you look at various countries, they actually have systems in place that control and modulate intangible things like morality. So infrastructure is big, and it has a very, very wide definition.
So, in the context of development, how can infrastructure become a force of productivity, enhancing structural transformation, and deliver the much-needed economic and social change in most of the developing world?
As a matter of fact, that is precisely what infrastructure development and planning focuses on. That's what it's actually supposed to do. It's supposed to identify the needs of a society, whether they are physical, whether they are financial, even emotional. It's supposed to take a look at where the key strengths of the society lie. It's supposed to look at where the society wants to go, because there are different ways of delivering different destinations. And there are actually developed techniques and measures that can be taken to address the direction of infrastructure development based on what the strategic objectives of a country or a nation may be.
Some experts have suggested that there is too much emphasis on, in this part, there is too much emphasis on infrastructure as a business opportunity and too little emphasis on its links to structural transformation. Do you agree?
Yes, I do. I do, because infrastructure is not just about bricks and mortar, as you rightly put it. In many countries, when they look at what they're trying to deliver, they always start from what the strategic objectives are in that society. Are we looking at safety? Are we looking at education? Are we looking at health? Are we looking at law enforcement? And what you tend to find out is that when infrastructure plans are laid out, even in a big organization like a government, all the MDAs in planning their capital development actually have to coalesce around what those objectives are. So I agree entirely with that statement. Nigeria, for example, might be in a situation where our problems and our objectives are different from Ghana. It doesn't mean that because we're both in West Africa, we're going to have exactly the same kind of infrastructure impetus. So yes, you have to really, really look at yourself and be particular about where you want to go to as an organization, and make sure that all the constituent parts of that organization or country, be it a country or a company, line up behind that strategy.
It's been estimated that about $3 trillion is required to close Nigeria's infrastructure gap over the next 30 years.
Yes.
What are the best options, in your opinion, for financing infrastructure in developing countries such as ours? Public finance, private debt, private equity, or a combination of these?
It has to be a combination of these, because the first thing we want to understand is that private equity and private finance will only go after tollable infrastructure that can give them returns on their investment. But there's also another category of infrastructure known as social infrastructure. These are infrastructure that do not necessarily have a profit motive. And typically you find out that such infrastructure lie in the basket of the government to try and deal with. So it has to be a mixed bag of solutions, financing solutions that we must look at. But I must mention something here, and it's very, very important for us to understand this in Nigeria. we have had a history of working under the traditional procurement system. I mean, most of our processes, most of our systems, most of our procedures in government, both the federal and the state government, are all built around the old traditional procurement system, in which you have a lot of money and very, very little need for private or extra funding. Things have changed now, as things have changed all over the world. And there's an increasing need to get the private sector involved in providing your infrastructure solutions. And this is why you have tools like the public-private partnership. This has developed, although I would say that in my observation, it is a very, very rarely understood phenomenon in Nigeria, because I have worked with quite a number of practitioners across the country, and there's always a little bit of misunderstanding coming through when you're dealing with private sector investors. For one, private sector investors are in there to make their money. You, on the government part, are in there to satisfy the people and to try and deliver services at relatively affordable rates to them. So if you look at all your infrastructure needs as a government, for instance, it's always best to start with the process of separating the ones that you feel will be tolerable and attractive to the private sector, and then look at the ones that you know you just have to deal with yourself. And then there are ways to proceed along both paths. But most importantly, I see a very, very important and urgent need for reorientation, both at the federal level and at the state levels, in the bureaucracy, for being able to do this and for being able to engage more effectively with the private sector.
You know, there are, as we know, there are three primary ways that cities can look to raise money for urban infrastructure, for example, asset sales and land development, public-private partnerships, as you alluded to, asset monetization and securitization. The size of Nigeria's infrastructure gap, no doubt, will mean that more public-private partnerships will continue to happen. How can risk sharing in the current PPP framework be improved?
Oh, well, PPP actually centralizes itself around risk sharing. There are certain things that the government is better suited to do, and there are certain things that the private sector is better suited to do. For me, it's always good to start on a template of honesty between both partners and to actually put on the table what both partners bring into the partnership. For example, when it comes to dealing with bureaucracies, getting permits, dealing with local communities and things like that, the government is very, very well suited in doing this. But when it comes to dealing with new technology, dealing with new processes, disruptive technology, dealing with much more sophisticated projects, it's always good for the risks to be put on the table and for everybody to understand exactly what they're taking on. For example, we have a peculiar problem in Nigeria. I'll illustrate this problem by a favorite example of mine. If you look at London, England, for example, London, England has a population of about 8-9 million people. They have various sports, rugby, soccer, volleyball. They have a lot of sports going on there. And they just have about 8 million people. But if you look at London, they have about 10, probably a bit less, maybe 8, standard stadiums there. Now, contrast this with Lagos, Nigeria. Lagos, Nigeria has a population of about 20 million people. We have essentially just one national sport, which is football. But I put it to you that it's going to be much easier for me to raise money to build one more stadium in London for 8 million people who have other competing sports to look at than it will be for me to raise money to build one new stadium in Lagos. And the reason this is so...
Why?
The reason this is so is because private investors always look at something you call the throughput, the user throughput. It is the user throughput that pays for the asset. When you go to England, for example, you know that the tinker, the tailor, the soldier, the sailor, rich man, poor man, everybody can afford to go into the stadium every Saturday and watch a football match. So it's not difficult for me to convince a financier to give me some money to build a stadium because I can demonstrate that I'm going to have a lot of people going in there to patronize the services. But when it comes to Nigeria, we have a major problem. We have a huge population which a lot of people look at, but this population does not have any purchasing power that is worth talking about. I am a football addict. I watch all football matches that I can, and I've never paid because I've always found a way of being invited, or I've always been invited by friends. But also, I'm happy to pay. But more importantly, millions of lovers of sports in Nigeria cannot afford to pay 1,000 naira every week to go and watch football in the stadium.
But you know, another problem, though, would be contracts. Legally enforceable contracts.
Yes.
Private investments in public infrastructure is increasing as the risk-return trade-offs are better understood by the private sector. One of the key requirements, as you know, to attract private investment to a city infrastructure such as the one you've mentioned is a clear articulation of the risk allocation between the city and the private sector codified through legally enforceable contracts. But this has often been problematic. Examples abound in Lagos State, for example, no?
Yeah. Okay, so I'll just quickly finish up and say that in the example I gave you about the stadia, if a private investor wants to come in, he most likely will be asking us in Nigeria to guarantee the throughput for the government to underwrite whatever he loses from those that cannot pay to come and watch the football matches. So that's the point I was making there. Now, when you talk about the legal system, that is a major concern of private investors. They want to see that your legal system has sufficient integrity to protect their investment. They want to see that the rule of law is sacrosanct in your society, and there are no people, there's nobody really that can contend to be above the rule of law. So yes, you're very, very correct at that. There's so many other things that they look at. I mean, they look at, do we even have the legislation that permits the particular investment that they're coming to look at? And in the event of disputes, do we have sufficient and reliable dispute resolution and affordable mechanisms? There's so many questions that they look at that we have to prepare ourselves essentially to be able to attract and earn the confidence of serious and honest private investors. Because there are some private investors who understand that our weaknesses, and they come in and you can see straight up that they're de-risking their project to such an extent that it becomes a farce.
But despite what you said earlier, one report I read asserts that investment in African infrastructure can be very profitable, with returns more than twice as high as the rest of the world. How can this be realized? Yes,
it can be realized by making sure that, first of all, we have close to full employment. Because don't forget, infrastructure use is paid for by the population, by the public. Who are we building the health service for? Who are we building the highway, the tollable highway for? It is for people. And everybody, as many people as possible, must be able to put their hands in their pocket and pay the toll. So when you look at the population we have in Africa, all that remains is for us to develop our human capital to such an extent that they are all, as much as possible, earning living wages. If we can do that, we will not have any problem whatsoever in being able to attract investors.
When the word infrastructure is mentioned, the name China comes to the lips of most people these days, as most of the infrastructure projects are now funded by China. Many of the infrastructure projects, I must say. What's happening with the World Bank, the IMF, foreign governments such as those of USA, Britain, and a host of others that Africa used to rely upon?
Well, I think my personal view is that many of the Western lenders have slept at the wheel. They took us for granted to a large extent. Having said that, they have much more stringent and less flexible terms and ways of negotiating infrastructure transactions. China is coming from a much more recent history of underdevelopment. So they tend to show a little bit more understanding in where we are today, and are able to help us navigate around some of the challenges that we have. For instance, data. We're very, very poor as a country in keeping data. And if you don't have sufficient data upon which to base your economic decisions, then you're going to find yourself taking a lot of educated guesses and using other methods. Some of them they work, of trying to establish whether or not particular blocks of infrastructure will be worth your while or not. So,
we're running out of time, so I want to quickly talk about the Lekki Free Trade Zone. Okay. In 2010, Lagos State, in partnership with China Africa Lekki Company, embarked on the phase 1 development of that free zone that you are in charge of. Give us a 10-year scorecard of that project, if you will.
10-year. Well, we've done very, very well under the circumstances. It's the Lekki Free Zone is actually a massive, massive, massive infrastructure project at this stage that a lot of people do not quite understand. It's 22 times the size of Victoria Island. And if I start from that premise, we all know how long it took to get Victoria Island from Federal Palace to Eco Hotel. It took the best part of 20 years. So in the last 10 years, to have been able to attract about 40 functioning investors into the zone, to be able to initiate and start the Lekki Port project, to be right now in the throes, with the support of the Lagos State government and the governor of Lagos State, in the throes of beginning some very, very massive highway development projects around the zone. We're also looking at an airport project. A lot has happened in the last 12, 14 years.
The Lekki Deep Sea Port is a critical infrastructure. I know that it's expected to attract more investors into the zone and ensure return on investment. How quickly is that going to be realized?
Well, the financing for the Lekki Deep Sea Port was concluded last November. We managed to raise close to $1 billion for that project. The project started in earnest. Even though they'd been doing quite a bit of pre-project work before then, but they actually started in earnest going into the new year, and then COVID started, and we got locked down. When it started, we had a 28-month schedule ahead of us. But with the COVID delays and some restrictions in the number of people you can have on site, I would estimate that we might be out about 38, 36 months, which is not bad.
It's not bad.
Yeah, at least the most difficult part, which is the funding, is in.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much, Tunde Sodade. We thank you for your time. Fortunately, we've run out of time, and we look forward to seeing you again next week when we come around. Thank you for watching today's program, and do have a good weekend.